Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Geopolitika. Today we're going to be discussing global health and patients' rights. With me I have Jason Giardina, our co-host, and shall we kick off with a couple of very interesting, exciting background historical points
Let's do it.
to build on. Okay, so in a couple of other programs, we had mentioned the Rockefeller family, owners of Standard Oil, one of the richest families in the world and the United States. And of course, they were very big, as we said, on oil, petrochemicals. And from petrochemicals, we know that they moved to pharmaceuticals, which is interesting because before the turn of the last century, the 20th century, most remedies, medicines, were more naturally based. And suddenly, a new form of product, if you wish, started to appear, which was petrochemically based. And many people don't realize that a lot of the pharmaceutical drugs did actually start off by being byproducts, as it were, of the petrochemical industry. And this could, of course, create problems. You'd say, a petrochemical product, I'm taking that into my body. What sort of ingredients are there in this particular pharmaceutical drug? Could they be, apart from being possibly beneficial, could they be also detrimental? And what has happened to the natural remedy, natural products industry? Well, it's still alive and kicking, but essentially there has been a secret war against natural remedies. Because like in any other industry, you don't want to have competition. Because competition means you're making less money. So you want to try to kill the competition. And unfortunately, we've seen historically over the last 100 years, and more so in the last 20, 30 years, the established pharmaceutical industry, which has had many problems with the law, because there have been many pharmaceutical companies have been fined or have agreed to out-of-court settlements numbering billions of dollars in settlements. And they have really focused on squeezing out the natural remedy competition, as it were. So fast forward to this century. Where are we now? Well, we know what's happened the last 2-3 years. The World Health Organization has now been in the driving seat in formulating international policies regarding health. And, well, could we use the word dictating to countries? Because when you look at the documents, they say, well, these are recommendations. But to what extent are they really recommendations? And to what extent are they being recommendations, but that come with a bit of a strong arm tactics? Because essentially, many countries are under obligation to follow the guidelines of the World Health Organization. So you might call them guidelines, but if you look at read the fine print and see that essentially the guidelines are actually more than guidelines, but those recommendations you expect your countries that are members of the World Health Organization to follow those guidelines, then they're not really guidelines. So, natural remedies, complementary medicine. Do you have any comments about that?
Well, those natural remedies, those alternative remedies have been under attack by legislation internationally for quite some time. We can go back to the 1990s, where certain natural remedies were legalized and made illegal. And we see it even today. We still have many natural products. In fact, it was the Rockefeller family who initiated the propaganda campaign against hemp, because hemp oil was a natural remedy and caused quite a bit of competition to Rockefeller's burgeoning health empire. And so he tried to have politicians create this fear campaign against cannabis and hemp in order to create support to make it criminalized. So and we see this going forward now, even today, where we have other natural remedies being criminalized as well, and we have this it seems to be this concentration of companies in big pharma, which are obviously buying each other out. We have some very big producers and very few minor producers.
Yes. Well, it's interesting that you mention the Rockefellers' intervention when it came to hemp, because hemp was also a major competitor for cotton.
That's right.
So the cotton industry, which again was cornered by a couple of very powerful families, they had an interest in putting down hemp because it was competition. As we know today, that the pesticides and herbicides that are used to grow cotton are far more than what would be used to grow hemp, because hemp is much tougher and could be grown in a more natural way. Right. So again, we're looking at the same principles. Natural remedies, natural products like hemp, I mean natural as in requiring fewer herbicides, whereas cotton would not. So yeah, cotton is also a natural product, it's grown. But which would be easier, which would be more sustainable, a word we like to use today, which is more sustainable to grow and to develop. If it's coming from the competition, then you need to destroy it.
Right. And it's amazing that they were able to actually criminalize a natural product like hemp, which can grow almost anywhere.
Yes, I mean, certainly, if you're growing hemp as part of to furnish and supply the clothing industry, what on earth could be wrong with that?
Exactly.
It's crazy.
And we are still dealing with the repercussions of that.
100 years later.
100 years later, exactly.
100 years down the line. So yeah, who's dictating policies? Again, the very rich and powerful dictating policies, influencing our policymakers, and influencing legislation with their mega lobbies. And speaking of mega lobbies, you've got the lobbies on the one hand in Brussels, Washington, London. We've mentioned these in previous episodes about how powerful these lobby groups can be, pushing for policies that are in the interests of these large companies. But then we have another major problem, which is the famous revolving door policy. What is a revolving door policy? As with a revolving door, if you don't step out from the exit to the entrance, you can go back out or back in, right? It's the whole idea of the revolving door. And you have people within industry, qualified and taking up posts within industry. They leave a particular industry, in this case, pharmaceutical, and they go into the regulating bodies. Major problem. So you're coming from the pharmaceutical industry, and suddenly you've left those companies, and you're now a regulator.
And the opposite.
And of course,
you become a regulator,
often,
you retire from regulation,
exactly.
and they hire you at the companies that you were once regulating.
Exactly. So imagine you do have a public office as a regulator, and you would know that after a few years, you would want to increase your chances of getting a good job somewhere else. So how good are you going to be as a regulator if in the back of your mind you're saying to yourself, oh, well,
I got a seat over at that company.
I don't want to bite the hand that might
one day
feed me in the near future. You know? So this revolving door policy is
horrendous for health.
And it's absolutely horrendous.
Just to go slightly off point here, this revolving door policy doesn't just occur in the health industry. It also occurs, for example, in industries like military, which is quite dangerous, because that's how wars are. That's how wars are initiated, where you have these ex-military men entering into into these the industrial, war industrial companies, and then they are dictating what policies should to politicians, who are then saying, okay, we can start a war. We have that person on the inside in that company, and monies are getting exchanged, and it becomes quite a horrific situation in terms of what happens geopolitically with war.
Well, it reminds me of something that President Eisenhower of the United States had said in his last address to the nation before leaving office. And the new president-elect was John F. Kennedy. And he specifically said in his last address to the nation that the people, and of course the leaders who would follow, had to be extremely vigilant of what he himself, the President of the United States, had called the unwarranted influence, I quote, of the military-industrial complex. And we've had these warnings. President Kennedy also issued his own warnings. There have been a number of presidents and other leaders in Europe who have tried to bring this to the fore and warn people. But sadly, the power shift has been moving more and more away from democratically elected leaders to these persons who've got the regulators in their pockets through the revolving door policies. As you said, the military is something that has a major consequence, not just on the economy, but on people's lives, creating
but certainly
weapons.
This revolving door policy in the health industry is detrimental to health, because the focus shifts from the health of citizens to profit. How do you skirt the regulatory process? Obviously, if you have someone from the regulatory board on your company's board, you're going to know how to skirt that process far better.
Well, apart from that, you actually see that certain regulatory organizations actually have a financial stake in the pie, because they would have patents registered in the name of those regulatory organizations. And if they were to push those products, be they vaccines, be they other pharmaceutical products, they would stand to gain quite a fortune, either as individuals or as organizations. So there you obviously have a conflict of interest, a mega conflict of interest. So remember that our title of the episode today is not just global policy regarding health, but also patients' rights. So this is the problem when we're talking about a system that is moving to support big industry. Is this not being done at to the detriment of the individual patient? This is ultimately a big problem.
Absolutely.
And is the World Health Organization today what it was 50 years ago, 40 years ago? When you see the World Health Organization that has amassed a tremendous amount of influence, that has changed definitions. They've changed definitions of what constitutes a pandemic, of what constitutes a vaccine, of what constitutes a crisis of international concern, a global health crisis of international concern. And if they are amassing more power and influence, and ultimately countries will end up having to follow the dictates of an organization like that, which was set up internationally through an international treaty, does that give any possibility to a country to say, listen, this is not what I signed up for? It's a bit like a club, no? I mean, to use layman's language, if a country has signed up to a treaty, it's a bit like an individual signing up to a club with the club's rules. If those club rules change very drastically, you say, well, I'm not really happy to remain a member of a club, but let's use another example, because you're not obliged to remain a member of a club, so you can leave anyway. So let's look at the laws of contract. So we've signed a contract. It could be a multilateral contract between a number of parties. And one of the parties starts to change the name of the game within the contract. You're supposed to provide me with certain products or services, and you're not. I'm supposed to be providing you with payment, and I'm not. So there's a reason, if there's a breach of contract because the initial terms of those contracts are not being met by one of the parties, that would allow, at law, the other party to say, well, you are in breach of the contract. So what is an international treaty? It is like a contract. It is a commitment, an undertaking carried out by a country when it signs up to a contract and ratifies that contract. Its parliament then ratifies the contract that the government would have initially signed up to. So if the nature of the game changes and the World Health Organization starts to impinge on the sovereignty, the health sovereignty, the sovereignty of a country and its government to decide its own health policies, and in ways that could be very detrimental to its people, would this not be a form of a breach of the initial conditions of a treaty? And this gets interesting from a legal point of view, an academic point of view, but also from a practical one. Because essentially, we do have a convention. It's called the Vienna Convention, that was signed in 1969. And I believe it came into effect quite a few years later, I believe 1980 or so. And this is the Vienna Convention is specifically on treaties. And if we were to look at the details of this treaty, when I say we, including our governments, our leaders, I would invite them to look into the details of the Vienna Convention, because the convention goes into the details, into the specifics of what constitutes an obligation by a party to the treaty, by a country, and what makes it possible for a country to withdraw from that specific treaty. Why do I mention this? Because if we see in years to come, in the immediate years to come, that the World Health Organization is pushing through changes that are very draconian, that are giving it much more power, and taking the decision-making process of health, which ultimately should be for the benefit of the individual patients, and taking that power away from our national governments that are being elected by us as the sovereign people. It is the people who are sovereign. Then that sovereignty is being taken away from our governments and being taken away from us, because it's not the government that is sovereign. The government is representing the people that are sovereign. It is the state which is sovereign.
And if we thought that top-down dictates would affect us negatively in a political sense, imagine how negative top-down dictates would affect the individual at a health level, because when you're speaking about health, it's all based on an individual. What is the individual's symptoms, their age, their weight, and so it's not a one-size-fits-all policy that they can. There's no practicality in that whatsoever, because we're talking about individuals' health here.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, without having to go into the nitty-gritty scientific and medical details, from a legal perspective, every patient has a right to know what treatments are being advised, whether he or she would accept those, especially when it comes to medical interventions. They have every right to take the decisions themselves and not to have decisions imposed upon them from above. That is very important. The rights of patients are secured by international law. And it's very important that this international law becomes part and parcel of local and national laws. Sometimes it's not so much the case. But that is very important, because we have international commitments and we need to sign up to these international commitments, because it is the patient that it has to be the center of these policies. And if a patient would prefer to take another route, using natural remedies, complementary remedies, then the question arises, what are the options? Are those options available in the country where he or she is living? Is the massive health budget going only towards a system which is supporting the big pharma, the pharmaceutical industry, and working against, as it were, natural remedies? That's another big question when it comes to individual patients' rights.
Mm-hmm. There seems to be this shift towards shift away from the individual and towards the collective. When we talk about health, there seems to be this underlying principle that, you know, you are duty bound, you are obligated to consider the health of your fellow citizen, and that's I think is a fundamental shift, because it kind of imposes upon you this obligation to accept these dictates from these high level organizations versus actually taking your situation, your health situation, to your general practitioner, your doctor, to say, hey, you know, what do I have? How can I heal myself? And it's almost like a political shift, not just a health shift. There's this fundamental shift in political thinking that the collective have to take on board these dictates for the collective.
That's very dangerous,
mm-hmm.
because ultimately the rights of the individual always have to take precedence. And where you have national policies that are taken in the benefit of all for the greater good, that's all well and good, as long as you don't impinge on people's individual rights.
Mm-hmm.
And the right to choose medication and forms of treatment is now considered to be part and parcel of the fundamental rights of individuals.
Moreover, the social contract, if they're going to speak about the obligations of the collective, part of that social contract is also having the collective the ability to have all the information available to them. You know, what are the alternatives? What are the alternative medicines? You know, what are their options? If we censor these alternatives, if we don't allow these alternatives to be available to the collective, then we're only taking one part of the social contract and not the social contract in its entirety, where, you know, the collective are allowed to have, or should have, the right to have this information available to them.
Yes. Well, we're going back to the problem of the revolving door policies. Because if there's a conflict of interest, those who are regulating are actually pushing big pharma.
Mm-hmm.
That is a conflict of interest.
Absolutely.
They should be pushing public policy, public health policy, not in the interest of big pharma. They should not be indirect agents of big pharma, and certainly should not be financially gaining because they might have patents that they themselves are involved in, all the organizations are. So that is certainly a big problem.
And this code of conflict of interest, they were put in place for these specific purposes, you know, to protect the collective, to protect the individual.
But again, I think it's getting worse. Not to sound terribly pessimistic, but if you see the trend over the last 20 years, the people in the world who have been moving towards alternative remedies, natural remedies, complementary remedies, whatever you'd like to call them, has been increasing very substantially. Mm-hmm. In other words, the competition for big pharma has grown.
Yep.
And even with the problem of the revolving door policies and public policies from governments seeming to favor big pharma, there has been a movement away from big pharma,
absolutely.
By the people.
Absolutely.
And this is why it's very serious, because this is being challenged. There is a situation where a lot of persons who are practicing in natural remedies and practices, and persons as patients who are looking to these, are being put under very, very serious pressure and strain. That is a major problem for us. That is completely going against people's fundamental rights to choose their remedies.
And ironically enough, the more that they try to censor these alternatives, the more people start to increase their distrust of big pharma and look for these alternatives.
Yes. And I think people need to educate, empower themselves with knowledge. To give you an example, when a woman is going in to hospital to deliver a baby. In many countries, there's this standard practice for the medical community to give vitamin K vaccine or injection. But again, this is the call of the mother.
Absolutely.
But if people don't know their rights and they simply go oblivious to what might happen, then unfortunately the medical establishment might consider what they consider, what we talk about in law as a form of tacit consent. If you haven't said anything, and this is our policy to give these vitamin K shots to a newborn baby, then they'll go ahead and do it.
Yeah.
So you need to know your rights and present yourself with instructions in writing under no circumstances should any shots be given without my consent.
And unfortunately,
this is very important, because once they have that in writing, then they're going to be 100 times more careful, because they have very specific instructions. If you don't give those instructions, and say, well, there was tacit consent. It's been public policy, no one ever says anything, we went ahead, we did it. What can you do at that stage? It's too late.
And unfortunately, the more that we accept these dictates from organizations like the WHO and the CDC, the less familiar we become with our own national laws, which allows us to choose not to consent.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I don't know if there's anything else we could add at this stage. It's a vast subject, but I think the most important is the important thing is for people to understand that if they have rights as patients, they need to inform themselves. When they go to their doctors or their hospitals, they need to know what their rights are. Because as we had said in previous episodes, if people do not participate, then they're going to be led. And the world is made up of leaders and those who are led. But if you're going to allow yourself to be led when it comes to decisions that are important for your health and the health of members of your family, etc., then you need to inform yourselves, because if something does go wrong, afterwards it's a bit too late. Prevention is better than cure, they say. And if you look at the statistics, not to knock the existing medical situations, but if you see the number of deaths caused in the Western world, the so-called developed world, the deaths that are arising out of a combination of misdiagnosis, negative reaction to treatments,
or medical malpractice,
and mistakes in surgery, etc., and you put all those together, in other words, medical errors, as it were, that accounts for about 1 in every 3 persons who are dying in hospitals. 1 in every 3. 30%. Yep. So, again, it's too late afterwards if the damage is done. I don't think anyone wants to be part of that 30%. And why is it so high? Why shouldn't it be pushed down to 20%, 10%, 5%? Something is wrong with the system. So people need to empower themselves. I think that's very important. And I think even doctors need to empower themselves.
Yes, absolutely.
Because it seems like the doctors, by empowering themselves, I don't mean trying to impose on their patients and telling them, dictating, this is the only way, that's etc., etc., listen to me, and that's it. Empowering themselves, because I think that the big system, the big pharma system, which has crept into the policy making and the regulating of the medical policies, public policies, the problem is that I think the doctors might be squeezed out.
Yes, they need to stand up for their patients and for the right to have patient-doctor privilege, that relationship, that they need to fight to maintain that yes. relationship, regardless of the pressure they may feel from regulators about their licenses, because at the end of the day, if it's not about the doctor-patient relationship, then we have a major problem.
Yes, I think so. I think that if patients feel that the doctors themselves are feeling disempowered, then they're going to move away from those doctors. If they feel that the doctors are fighting for their rights, sticking up for their rights, then they're going to improve that relationship.
And if the voices of the doctors are going to be suppressed, then the patients are going to have really no first line of defense in order to for the information that they require. Usually doctors are the first place that people go to get the information that they need. And then maybe they might research afterwards. But if you have doctors who are being suppressed, then really patients are left to their own devices, which is not a good scenario.
Well, an interesting development is this so-called telemedicine. Because telemedicine, in the initial days, you could still have individual doctors who are calling the shots at a distance now. But there's nothing stopping the system from phasing out those doctors and relying more and more heavily on artificial intelligence.
Absolutely.
It's a bit like the drone system. Before you had the pilots who would be in the air, in the planes, and it's their final call. Absolutely. Whether to let off a missile or a bomb, because if they felt that for some reason they would not be following proper protocol, then the pilot would actually refrain from shooting that missile, because he might feel, no, there's going to be too much collateral damage, and there are civilians, etc. It's his call at the end of the day, and his superior officers would not be in a position where they can completely dictate, because there are leeways. But then once you replace the pilots, in this case we're talking about the doctors, with drones, with artificial intelligence, then you don't have that other check, the checks and balances. Right. You don't have the person on the ground or in the air who is closer to the scene and who should be involved in the decision-making process, because it's all happening from above. Whether it happens to be the drones with military interventions, or it happens to be AI with medical interventions. Right. This might sound extremely far-fetched or conspiratorial to some, but doctors need to look at this, because for the first few days, the first few years, it will be all hunky-dory. Our telemedicine is working well, and we've got all this artificial intelligence. And before you know it, they've been squeezed out, and all the decisions are being taken by artificial intelligence. It could happen also with law.
Yeah,
absolutely. And judges can be replaced
it's not that far-fetched
by artificial intelligence taking decisions.
It's not that far-fetched, because they allowed AI to do the I can't remember which school it is now, but they exposed AI to the pre-med exam, and it passed.
There you go.
So
yeah,
we're already halfway there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'd like to conclude on one thing that I had noticed in the last couple of years. With a number of adverts of pharmaceutical products on the Italian television, whoever is still watching Italian TV in Malta, there's a choice, and maybe not many people are watching that anymore. So many adverts are actually telling the people, consult your pharmacist.
Yes.
Consult your pharmacist. It's like the doctor has been squeezed out in these adverts that are advertising pharmaceutical products.
Which used to be illegal.
That's
right.
Because the pharmaceutical industry did not have the legal possibility to advertise their products, because those products had to be prescribed by doctors. And not even by the pharmacists, by the doctors.
And now we seem to be bypassing that.
And we're bypassing that because some countries have changed the laws, allowing big pharma to advertise on TV. So you've got all these drugs, these medical drugs in your face on TV. And now they're also telling you, consult your pharmacist. So consult your pharmacist.
It seems like
the retailer, because the pharmacists are the retailers ultimately.
It seems like
and where is the doctor?
That's right. And it seems like an incremental step towards top-down prescription of medicines, because if we pass the doctor, we went to the pharmacist. How long will it be before we pass the pharmacist and go to government, and then from government to maybe WHO prescribes it for everybody?
Yes, but it's also a bit more complicated than that, because the pharmacy might actually be owned by Big Pharma itself.
As well.
Chains of pharmacies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Secondly, they might have chosen for their own commercial purposes to stock a particular drug and not a competition drug. So if they're going to advise you, they'll say, yes, take this drug because this is the one they have available.
And you have the profit margin
Whereas,
involved.
For example, doctors in the UK are forbidden at law from prescribing a particular brand. They can give you a specific type of medicine, but they will not specify a particular brand. But the problem is, if you go to the pharmacist, then again, you have more power in the hands of the pharmacist, because if the doctor is not prescribing, it's a knife that can cut both ways. Right. You see, if the doctor hasn't specified a particular brand, the pharmacist is going to give you the brand that they happen to have in stock, and they're okay because the doctor hasn't mentioned the brand. So you're still left with a problem.
And you've also introduced the profit incentive now as well with the pharmacist, whereas with the doctor relationship, you don't have that, because the doctor can choose. Okay, maybe the doctor will get a commission from a prescription, maybe, but there's no profit incentive. Whereas with a pharmacist, a pharmacy, with a drug company, you've got profit incentives.
Much more so with pharmacists. Unfortunately, with some doctors in some countries, you do have a problem that they could also be incentivized by the pharmaceutical industry. Yeah. Okay, so I think that's about it. Thank you very much for joining us. Please press the like buttons. Please share. Let's get the word around.
Subscribe.
We need, subscribe as well to channels, and share. And people need to empower themselves, and we do that with knowledge. So we're here not to brainwash or indoctrinate anyone, but try to give a bit of a legal explanation and discuss ways where individuals can empower themselves more. Thank you very much for watching. Have a good day.